Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, wherever you're joining us around the world. We're delighted to have you here with us today to learn more about the next step on our digital data journey, the data visualization and storytelling. For those of you who were able to join us this morning, you heard about good quality data and the techniques available to get your data into the best shape possible, including when and where it makes sense to apply such methods. Now you will hear from two brilliant subject matter experts, Zachary Ericetti of Bloomberg and Jonathan Horn of JP Morgan, who will tell us more details about how data can be used to communicate on your impact, namely when fundraising or presenting progress to your key stakeholders. As you know, at Bloomberg and J.P. Morgan, we strongly believe in the power of data and truly think that there is a role for us as businesses and as nonprofit organizations to play. Through knowledge sharing, innovative solutions can be scaled to achieve even higher impact goals. Please do send any questions using the Q&A box that you can see at the bottom of your screen, and we will make sure to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the session. So without further ado, I will now hand it over to Zachary and Jonathan. The floor is yours.
Perfect. So thank you, everyone. As said before, my name is Zachary Ericetti. I am the team lead for Bloomberg's Alternative Investment Funds data team, which means I oversee a diverse team of data and market analysts and help work and develop our private market fund products. And I'm joined here today by my colleague, Jonathan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. So Jonathan Horn, I work for JP Morgan. And I always take these opportunities to try and demystify banking a little bit. So the part of the bank that I work in, we do all of the, what we call back office, so fund accounting, administration, transaction processing, all the safeguarding of assets on behalf of our big clients. So those big clients are typically include fund managers, but also pension funds. So us getting it right all of the time, data being accurate, maintaining pristine kind of controls around the data is vital for all of the pensioners on the other side of that activity. And my personal interest is really around risk and control. So what can go wrong and how can we stop it? And then all things data, data storytelling, all of the things that we've talked about through all these sessions. Plus I also look after artificial intelligence, machine learning. So how can we get machines to help us make better, faster decisions?
Throughout both of our careers, I think we've had the opportunity to learn a variety of different technical skills, but the area probably Jonathan and I would agree that we're most passionate about would be data visualization. And I think it's time to start the lecture and the presentation here with that question. What is data visualization? And so if we can move to the first poll question. So what is data visualization? Is it the visual presentation of data or information? Is it the practice of creating bar charts, line graphs, and other types of graphic representations of numbers and information? Or is it the next topic for our session? Or D, all of the above? We'll give one moment for responses to come in. Brilliant. So many of you have correctly identified that, yes, it is all of the above. The correct answer is D. Data visualization is the practice of bringing your data to create a picture, an informative and illustrative representation of the relationship that's hidden within all of your information. It comes in many shapes and forms, from bar charts and line graphs to heat maps to infographics and more, but it all falls under this umbrella of data visualization. And we're here to talk to you about how you can effectively use data visualization to, to tell a story.
Okay, so storytelling, it's at the heart of all human communication. It's probably one of the oldest forms of communicating. People tell stories all the time. They understand the world through stories. So it's a really important skill that we can kind of master and develop. A little small fact actually I always enjoy and I find encouraging when faced with these kind of new skills to learn. It takes 10,000 hours apparently to become a concert pianist, but it only takes 20 hours to become vaguely competent at anything. And I learned that through some kind of research that I was reading. So I thought, okay, that's good. 20 hours I can face, maybe 10,000 hours I can't. So what I would encourage is people to kind of embrace this. It's a craft and a process that you can learn and become better at. So just on this, and I'd also kind of highlight this, a lot of this information is available also through Andy Kirk's website, which is at visualizingdata.com. He's an expert in this space. We use him a lot at J.P. Morgan to help us with our storytelling and to teach storytelling. So I'd also recommend going to that website and looking at it. So storytelling with data, so it's a particular version of storytelling, and it involves four kind of key factors. It's going to be human-centric. So it's really important that we think about, know, and understand our audience. It's data-driven, so we're talking about activities that are dealing with data, handling of data, managing of data, sources, quality of that data, and the tools we use to deal with it. It's about effective communication, so how can we most rapidly and clearly and impactfully get across our point? And it's also kind of a design activity, so it's super creative. It involves choices around what's going to be visually impactful, what's going to deliver clarity, and like so many things, it's the fine choices around the form and the colors and the representation of these things that really help kind of be more impactful. And a lot of what we'll show later, including many examples, is designed to kind of help people get better at that stuff. I would also say, just from my point of view, I think there's also an important ethical dimension to this, because as we tell stories with data, we've also got the editorial responsibility of representing what's true. It's fine, as in any editorial activity, to make sure that you're imparting an impactful piece of information, but the responsibility is in making sure that we're not hiding the wrong things, illuminating the wrong things, and so on and so forth. So I think there's also an ethical dimension to storytelling.
I agree with everything there that Jonathan said. There's so much that you can unlock in terms of helping craft a narrative with data visualization, and it's very much dependent upon you as the individual, how to use that to most effectively sell that narrative, tell your stories. To recap though, simply on these segments here that we just covered, these principles, pop quiz. We can move to the next polling question. What are a few guiding principles to bear in mind when storytelling with data? So listed out here, we have A, develop for particular audiences, use underlying data to present details and facts in an accessible way. B, scientific and technical language only, should convey all objective information and present without emotion or editorialization. Or C, audience agnostic, universal, centered more on intuitions, gut feelings, and the interpretation of facts rather than specifics. Or D, should be specifically made for bedtime reading. And brilliant. So most respondents chose A, develop for particular audiences, use underlying data to present details and facts in an accessible way. And what we wanted to at least highlight with this question is that there's a middle ground. There's a fine line between the straight facts and details and the editorialization that Jonathan was alluding to. And data visualization is somewhere not in between, but combining both, using the data and the information and the objective analytics to tell a story, to craft a narrative, and try to have your readers understand what the message is that's hidden in all of the information. So we have here two quick examples maybe to help highlight those points. And the intent here is that at a high level, the graphs shown here help inform readers in a memorable and effective way. The example on the left with the multicolored bar chart relates to CO2 emissions over time. And just starting at a macro level, taking a step back and seeing the overall impact, two things stand out. First, the graph looks like it's increasing as we look left to right. The total emissions per month of carbon dioxide is growing. And despite there being a dip or two per every other odd month, it seems overall that there's a clear trend upward. And that's one clear narrative that's built out. The second part that stands out, a strange drop in the yellow and green color around March 2020. It looks like for some reason, overall emissions related to travel and commuting had vanished. I'll leave it to the audience to speculate for themselves what global events may have caused this decline in travel and commuting emissions, but the illustrative point here is that this chart visually communicates a few key narratives. It starts to build a story that increasing trend of carbon dioxide emissions, or perhaps that drop we just mentioned, in a very quick and effective way. And if we take a moment to explore how these visuals then relate to those storytelling principles we mentioned earlier, being human-centered, data-driven, effective forms of visual communication, we can start to imagine the context in which these graphs were developed. On the human-centered perspective, I think it's easy for any of us here to be able to read the labels and recognize the topic, emissions over time. If this were a graph included in a scientific paper, it might be lacking a bit of detail or depth, but I think these were made more to be generally accessible to a broader audience rather than, say, a climate scientist. And I think they're effective to that end. But what about data-driven? Well, the charts themselves are a direct reflection of the numeric data captured in these areas. They directly are reflective of the objective measurements, and by simply putting these values into a graph, we can see how they are related to one another, how they move in tandem. And then finally, as far as visual communication, I'm sure if you read a transcript of someone talking about these examples, you can get the same insights. But a visual can be more effective, and you can get it much more quickly. And I would bet probably remember it more strongly. It's more efficient. We pulled these visuals somewhat out of context, but they're a key part of a larger effort to use data visualization and business intelligence to build a story that connects with audiences and leave stakeholders with stronger takeaways. And from here, we're going to talk through those key points, how to not only build your story, but how to choose data-driven visuals that help tell that story for you.
Okay, so as Zach said, so what we're going to follow on now with is really a toolkit, if you like, of sorts, a recipe book that'll help kind of give you a pathway to developing these visual stories. So, as we said, storytelling is a craft. You can learn it, it takes time, but it doesn't take as long as you necessarily think. In the next few slides, we'll kind of elucidate what the kind of steps are that you can kind of work through, a little checklist, if you like. So here, in terms of, first of all, defining and reaching your audience, so this is in the human-centric element of it. You've got to understand, and it's worth writing down, what's your main readership, so who you're trying to reach, how will they read this, where will they read this, what frame of mind will they be in, what's their thinking currently, so who's the actual readership of this story, where is the story, what's the actual kernel of what you're trying to say in terms of what's the most critical kind of element of the whole thing, so where is your story, how data literate is the audience. So one kind of unusual outcome, I think, of the COVID pandemic has been that we've all got a lot better at looking at charts and graphs and all the rest of it. And perhaps some of it was to do with Boris Johnson's R-number lecture early on in the COVID, like an open university lecture, but who knows? But we've become more data literate. People are used to looking at more bars and graphs and charts. But it's good to kind of think about, okay, for the general reader, how data literate will they be, and try and get a right balance in that space. What specific questions are you trying to answer? So what are you going to try and draw out through narrative and through data and through the visualization? What are the questions that you're trying to really grasp? And then what is the key message? And in this space, I always think about the kind of 3 Fs. What are people going to propagate from what you've said to family, to friends, to Facebook? How are they going to relay this story? We all remember stories. We often get the details wrong, but we always remember the kind of pithy kernel of what this was all about. A good little kind of exercise to do to try and help you do that is to give the 30-second version of the story. So if you had to get in the lift and give your story to someone in the lift, what would that be? Writing down that 30-second version clearly and concisely, using the elements we've talked about and thinking about these 5 kind of dimensions will help you craft this key message.
So pulling back further and perhaps maybe introducing a concept that takes many forms in the study of literature, but a storytelling arc. All good stories have an introduction where you set up the world, a period of rising action where you fill in the details and set the stage for what's coming, a climax, key turning point, a key insight, and then a conclusion and a moment where you leave your readers, your audience, prepared for the next steps. And storytelling with data follows very often that same sort of recipe. Let's walk through it. So your introduction sets the stage. You're going to tell the audience what you're going to tell them. You set up the foundation for the topic, prepare everyone for the journey, and here's where you make the purpose of the presentation clear and explain where you're going to lead them. If we're talking about our current presentation, we started by talking about what data visualization is and how it's an important tool for data-driven communication. In that, we set the stage for where we're going next. Then you build up your facts and you explain the situation, the fundamental aspect of knowledge that builds your case. And here's where the examples and details and individual key points are fleshed out. You might have several facts depending upon how ambitious of a message you're selling. And it's important that along the way, as you build visualizations for this narrative, that they're clear and they pertain to those facts. Otherwise, you may lose your audience along the way. Finally, then, the insight. That's bringing all the key facts together and giving them a reason for why your audience would care. What's their engagement, the story based upon? The key insight is something you want them to ultimately accept, understand, and walk away. The climax of your story. The facts build up and support, but in some ways you can almost summarize the facts by this key insight itself. And then for conclusion and next steps, you set the stage for wherever are the next steps. If you were writing a book, maybe you're setting up for a sequel. If you're delivering a presentation, it's about perhaps who's going to come next, or you're talking about maybe areas to explore further on the topic of research. In either case, it's leaving your audience with something for looking forward and for the next stages of whatever narrative you're telling. So let's go through a broad example using this framework. So the introduction in this example, setting the stage for what we're talking about, it's an example slide of a program called Skills of the Future, essentially an effort to do more skill training to some firm. This is telling your audience what you're going to tell them, what we're going to be talking about for the presentation. The facts in this case are shown towards the bottom of the slide, but it's the straightforward data analytics and metrics that feed into the narrative that's being built. In this case, it's giving a straightforward difference in hours per training at 2 different time points. It's very direct, and it gives a holistic truth of how many more hours per category, per competency, per the framing of the conversation. And then finally, that conclusion, that insight is center stage. It's clear and in focus for the audience. And if they walk away with anything, it's that part right there. And what is clear is that there has been a massive uptake in this program, saw a huge adoption across all skill sets represented by different colors at a very particular moment. And you can see that story, growing over time, month over month. And if this is a presentation to sell the success of this program, of getting more individuals on board with the upskilling or engaging with the trainings, it's clear that this chart would show that. And then the final parts, the conclusion and next steps, you tell them what you told them. You tell your audience exactly all the recapping from your facts and from your insight. In this case, it was that 2020 was a banner year for the program. There's the highlight of some of the more specific nuances in terms of where success was felt and measured, but ultimately that section there is to reinforce the key message from your earlier slide. And then it leaves space for next steps, where the next challenges would be, or where there's going to be room for this program to grow. The exact form that your presentation, your story will take through this storytelling structure is going to vary. It's going to depend basically on all those points that Jonathan was going over earlier, depending upon your audience, depending upon the topic. But by and large, you should see a very similar structural narrative being built of introducing a concept, building up to it, selling the truth of the matter, and then winding down for the next stage.
Okay, so this is another visualization from the whole program, the Skills of the Future program. And we're going to use the rest of this, this session to talk through some things that kind of encapsulated on these diagrams. First of all is the choice of diagrams. So here you see the 3 across the top. There's kind of a comparison diagram. There's a thing that helps you bring out some of the key themes. So this bubble diagram, and then there's a time series. So the escalating time series. The key point about these 3 charts, they're showing different things, but they're all part of a coherent message, and you can tell that by looking at the color. So for example, in the first chart, and here's where sort order is super important from a visual point of view. So you're starting with the biggest down to the smallest. You see that data and tech literacy was the most popular part of this whole training program. And that links with the second chart, which is designed just to bring out a few key themes about what courses were most interesting within those. And you can see straight away that data and tech literacy links with those three dark blue boxes. So introduction to Tableau or tools, we'll go out later. Agile, which is like a project methodology, and then artificial intelligence. Those blue boxes relate to tech and data and tech literacy. And then the other two darker grey boxes, actually straight away you can see visually they link to teamwork and leadership. And if you think about the time, that these courses were being run, managing remote teams and an introduction to emotional intelligence, those were two very important courses during the whole COVID pandemic and people locked down and so on and so forth. So we saw a big uptick in those courses. And then similar to kind of some of the earlier slides, the use of a time series, again linked through color, tells you about the escalating use of this program. So within three types of charts, three ways of looking at the world, but all linked with this coherent kind of use of color is really important. Sort order and time series are your kind of best friends. And then underneath this, a kind of an interesting thing, I was just reflecting on it before. When I look at this, so you're combining quite a few complex sets of data in these diagrams at the bottom. But what it tells you, if you look along the kind of horizontal axis, this is like seniority in the organization. And what it says is the more junior people are taking a lot more courses than the more senior people. I was just reflecting before we came on this call whether that was a good or a bad thing. But anyway, that's just a fact. So people can draw a conclusion from that. So I think we can go to the next poll. So which of the following is the proper storytelling structure? So introduction, facts, next steps, insight, conclusion, introduction, insight, facts, conclusion, next steps, introduction, facts, insight, conclusion, next steps, or introduction and conclusion.
I vote for option D, straight to the point.
We can see the results come up. Okay, great. So introduction, facts, insight, conclusion, next steps. And that's those patterns that we've just showed you from kind of right from the defining and reaching your audience and the 5 dimensions of that through to this arc of the story that Zach talked us through. That way of telling stories is, I'm not saying every story is like that, but a lot of very successful stories have that arc. So it's a really good place to start, and using that pattern, using that recipe will really improve storytelling over a period of time.
We're going to move into the next segment to talk through, and this is where we're going to get both a little bit more technical and practical. And so we talked about, how to construct your stories and how to convey your messaging, but let's talk about maybe more of the substance, about choosing the proper visuals for that story. So when constructing your story, how the chart is presented and the type of chart and visual is important, but equally as important is just having effective visualizations. You want people to focus on the message and have a clear takeaway and not get caught up by the actual illustration. So here we're going to talk through high-level principles. They're not always hard rules, but they are good guidelines that will ensure your visuals don't stray from that core purpose of telling your story. Use them as hard rules while you start, and when you start to build up a practice and experience and you start to find ways to alter the rules to build your message, then maybe it's time to change from them a bit. But starting out, number 1, keep it simple. Complex charts can be really great to look at, but they can also be distracting. If someone sees a graph and they think it looks beautiful, but it doesn't seem to be clear as to what it's telling you, it may not be doing its job effectively. So stick to straightforward, simple options when you can. Bar charts and line charts often answer most questions. Second order, sort order. And this alludes to what Jonathan was mentioning before. There should be a logical organization to how you have items presented, largest to smallest, alphabetical time series, you should know what's supposed to be next in that chart. If you're showing amounts, largest to smallest makes sense, but if you're showing dates, make sure it's days, the days and months don't jump around randomly. February comes after January, but before March. 3, title all charts to provide context. You can think of this sort of as an introduction to your visual and a mini story in of itself. Reading that title should tell you what you're looking at. And often charts and visuals will get copied out of their original documents or shown elsewhere outside of the broader context and presentation. So keeping a title that is pertaining to what the chart is about helps keep that mini story and context consistent. 4, labeling. Keep the placement of data labels at the end of bars or aggregated totals within the bar so it's clear which part of the chart it pertains to. I think this is most easily seen in the example on screen. If you look here, it's very clear which numbers relate to which segments and where the totals are. We can see the number for email or phone call or fax right next to it, and it's consistent throughout with the aggregated total at top. There's no confusion. It's clear. Readers shouldn't have to try to source or find where certain segments lead to. 5, use color sparingly. Color's great, but it can also be distracting and help muddle the message. So use color as a highlight for the key facts of your analysis rather than just for visual flair. It's also important to keep in mind accessibility. So for example, limiting red, amber, or green can be good practice when avoiding color blindness concerns. I recommend when selecting a color palette, or if you have questions about which colors are best to use, you can search online for pre-approved or preordained accessible color palette options. 6, eliminate clutter wherever possible. Remove grid lines if they're not essential to your story. Remove duplicate labels. So if you have items that are labeled on the chart, you don't need them in the same axis. Generally speaking, redundancy is not the goal here. It should be clear and effective, and that's it. Going back to that first point, keep it simple. And on that point, 7, font. Where possible, use the same font, use the same typeface, keep it the same style. If you start changing size or bolding and unbolding or changing the styling of the font in certain areas, it's definitely going to draw attention. But if you're just doing it without rhyme or reason, that means it's distracting from the broader narrative being portrayed. And then finally, user interface. This is more of a general comment that many of the data visualization platforms have very good defaults. So when in doubt, maybe stick to the defaults as they're presented. They have teams of analysts and workers who design those default templates so that they embed many good practices without you having to do additional work. Now, the next segment in terms of maybe the types of charts. With data visualization, the idea is to highlight key relationships between items. Your data points have some sort of relationship with one another, and that relationship is the story that the chart is bringing to the forefront. So some ideas to keep in mind with the presentation. First is distribution. This shows how your data is scattered, whether it's across any type of category, ages, numbers, segments, bands. You can see if there are clusters or gaps. In this example, we don't have the particulars of what the axes relate to, but you can see that there is almost a normal distribution of values around like a center point that peter out at the tail ends. And that's just a very clear way to show that statistical display of values in the data set. 2, composition, one aspect broken into many. Sometimes you want to highlight part of a whole, how some portion or segment of a group compares. And this horizontal bar chart example shows that how the blue portion across company A, B, C, and D compares, as well as how it compares within its own companies to the gray segment. It doesn't show the relative size of company A, B, C, or D, but it shows as a proportional representation what the blue means for each of the individual companies. 3, relationship. Again, over time, things change. And sometimes they change more, or sometimes they change less differently than others. If you chart them side by side, you can highlight the nature of that relationship, if they're all growing, and if they're all growing at the same rate, or if they're shrinking or changing or diverging, or any other sort of over time change. It's quite clear that by putting them side by side, it defines the relationship between the variables. And then finally, comparison, showing something that is just more different than others or more different than the norm. And I always think of this as, let's do the data points that stand out. In this bubble chart, company E is clearly larger and further from the 0 point on the axes. And this chart highlights that key fact. We didn't put labels on if it was about readership or engagement or about the size of the organization, but once you fill in those details, you can very clearly see what the relationship of these companies are to one another, or how one particular company stands out from the pack. And with that, we'll move to the next slide.
Okay, so we've talked through the kind of some really good guidelines around how to use your charts and some good examples of different charts to use under different circumstances. So just to kind of illustrate that, we're going to go through a couple of examples now of what we think of as kind of before and after. So both of these charts, perhaps even unbelievably, contain exactly the same information. But what we're seeking to kind of demonstrate using these rules and guidelines that we've kind of laid out, the chart on the right is perhaps more immediately impactful because it allows the reader to come to a conclusion much quicker about what's really happening and what's contained in the chart. First thing, which is often really easy to forget, is if you have a look at the title. So on the before, coffees consumed died day of week. Okay, fine. The problem with that title is then you have to do all the interpretive workload is then on the reader, because they then have to use their kind of capability at understanding data to really get to the main point about what this is about. And that's not helped by the colors that have been chosen in this chart on the left. And if you compare the left and the right, completely taking out all of the, if you like, spurious use of color and just using color very sparingly to highlight the key point. You're saying here, if you look at early morning coffee drinking, so early morning or very late at night, depending on your perspective, between kind of midnight and 6 a.m., you're twice as likely to drink a coffee between midnight and 6 a.m. at the weekend than you are during the days of the week. And that the use of color across the top in terms of the first 5 days, pale, and then slightly darker on the weekend, immediately draws the eye, and that's kind of an impactful message. And it ties straight into the title. This is the thing, again, we all make all the same mistakes, but often you've got to think about, does the title and what I've visualized actually tie together? And quite often they don't tie as tight as you might think. In terms of decluttering, you can see that you've taken away the kind of horizontal grid lines. We've shortened down the days of the week. They were kind of off slanted to one side, so kind of visually quite intrusive before, much simpler now. And also you're spelling out this message of weekday versus weekend using those little grid lines on the horizontal axis. And then the legend that was put across the top is now kind of down the side. So it's immediately refers to the information that's most important there. And that wasn't as easy to see when you had the color version and the labeling across the top. So pay attention to title and try and grasp the story in the title. So give people immediately what they should be looking at. Second thing is kind of eliminate all of the clutter that you don't need, grid lines, labels, all the other stuff. White space is much easier to look at and less confusing. Removing the legend and putting it in a space that makes more sense is very helpful. Using clear labels and so on, it's again just draws people to the right information. So we've got, and then the consistent use of color, and particularly to reinforce your conclusion in the title, you can see all of those elements brought together there. So I often find, when I've done a visualization, a good way of kind of approaching how to improve it would be to have a first go and then go back to those principles, those guidelines that we outlined before, and say, right, have I really nailed all of these, whatever there were, 7 or 8 points, and go and think about, is this going to satisfy those kind of 8 points that we had earlier? And then if we just go on to the next example, and this actually, even though Zach and I hadn't met before, kind of working on this together, we both have one thing, and we probably have many things, but one thing certainly in common, and that is that we believe that pie charts and the use of pie charts is really the embodiment of data visualization evil. So you've got to avoid at all costs pie charts. I know there's pie charts everywhere, but there's a couple of really good reasons why pie charts are very misleading, and they're really set out in this before and after example. They were much loved by various companies that will go unnamed for presenting their results. And particularly if you tilt a pie chart and make it 3D, it's incredibly difficult to come away with anything other than the conclusion that the thing nearest to you is the biggest segment by a long way. So that's why they kind of can be very misleading. So if you look at this, all of our principles that we kind of outlined before, use of color, sort order, trying to get the right chart. So here on the right-hand side, we've selected a comparison chart. So that's immediately what we're trying to do here. We're trying to compare. If you look at the pie chart, the green and the kind of purpley color, so company B and company C are on opposite sides of the pie. That doesn't make any sense in terms of the story we're trying to convey. So sort order and getting things in a logical order is really important. And by contrast, on the left, having this comparison with the correct sort order that immediately tells you the company B, which you've highlighted with a very sparing use of color blue, has the major market share. It's much more difficult to see that immediately from the pie chart. So sparing use of color, declutter, use color only to emphasize the key point. The title is very important and should tie very closely to the visualization. All of those things are very important. So my advice would be never use a pie chart, avoid the pie chart. And if you see anything with a pie chart on, immediately be very suspicious about the content and the meaning behind it. So with that, we'll go to the next poll.
Pop quiz. Which chart type should you not use? And we introduced this slide to be an illustrative point of that last point, which is the difficulty of using pie charts as effective visualizations. So we'll go through step by step on each of these charts and make comments, but feel free to answer the poll question. And we'll wait for the results to come in before moving forward. Seems to be a bit delayed, but we'll carry on. There we go. So
I was actually really interested in what the distribution would be like. So anyway, that's great.
Perfect. So just on that key point, it's a little bit of a joke, I think, also sometimes the hate for pie charts, but the reason why we introduce it here is to talk through why they're not good examples. So for option A, you can see that the colors are quite similar and narrow, and then the spacing makes the sizing tough to tell. It's a fairly studied fact that humans just don't have the most accurate sense of understanding proportions in terms of relative sizing. And I think always if you ask a layperson on the street to divide different fractions, at least speaking for myself, sometimes it takes a moment to try to remember exactly is 5/8 different from 3/4? Is it larger or smaller than whatever that may be? And that pertains to how people read pie charts. The sizing of those wedges aren't as intuitive as we think. Option B, this chart isn't too bad, but the same issue applies where we don't really always have an accurate sense. Is that blue section 2 or 3 times larger than the yellow section? Are the greens related, or is that just poor color options? It looks a little bit prettier as a donut chart with the hole in the middle, but it doesn't really do much to change the effectiveness of what this chart would be. Option C, it's 3-dimensional. That skewing to show a 3D sort of image of a chart hurts in terms of understanding the proportion of the red wedge to the green wedge. As well as we mentioned before, it may be better practice to avoid red and green when possible to avoid accessibility concerns. And then option D, you can see one of the very common issues that I run into with pie charts is that once you get beyond a few segments, or if you have small segments, it becomes very difficult to see what those are. And it becomes more distracting as people try to squint and look into what those wedges represent or what their sizes are, rather than telling the overall story for your data visualizations. So when in doubt, try to represent what you think you should use a pie chart for with a bar graph or some other option, because it's very likely that there's a different option, or even maybe a table of data if it's only a few numbers. But here we come to wrap our segment with some tools for effective storytelling. And we've listed out some options of platforms that are common in the data visualization world that you can access with different parameters around them to begin your data visualization journey. And so with this, I think we'll leave this here as a resource for a moment, but we're going to move to the question and answer segment of the conversation. So with that, we'll come to here for questions and bring it open to the moderation.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Jonathan. This was very helpful, and I think you perfectly outlined the importance of design thinking on this storytelling journey. Obviously, everyone is not a UX designer or have this fiber within itself. So, and I think it can be hard to find this balance in between what you want to say, the colors you want to use, the charts. So I wonder whether you can tell us what proved very helpful from your own experiences on your data visualization journeys, and what proved helpful, and perhaps the audience can learn from that.
Absolutely. I can start off with the question, Jonathan. So for me, in terms of what was most helpful, I think in my journey, especially starting out, was just the confidence for trial and error. I tend to be a very hands-on student, and I think that one of the benefits that data visualization has, maybe even compared to other aspects of using data for good, is that it's the visual feedback is immediate. It's not something where you run into structural issues or you get error messages that you have to parse. Rather, you can see fairly quickly what your visual look like, and from there you can start to play around and ask yourself, what is this telling me? Is this an effective way to showcase this message? And just start building your practice there. To that end, I think I very much encourage not only the resources shown before, but also even a pen and paper, and just start sketching out how you think you can maybe represent something in a graphic form, and going from there. And I think just over time, building the confidence and understanding of what to look for when using data visualization for whatever your purposes are.
Yeah, I agree with that, all of those comments, Zach. And so a lot of the data visualization, certainly at work, I do on this whiteboard behind me. So I find that a super useful thing. And I've got a load of little colored pens to help me kind of think about, certain things. I absolutely 100% agree with that. Having a go, and just having a go a lot. So doing a little, whenever you see something you think about visualizing, you're just having a little go is a great way to kind of get good at it. As I said, if you do something in a concentrated way for 20 hours, so once a day for a month, you'll get really good at this. So it's not, it sounds daunting, but it's not. It's actually quite straightforward. So I definitely advocate having a go. And then there's lots of resources. So I mentioned earlier this guy, Andy Kirk, that we use at JP Morgan. He's got this site called visualizingdata.com. He's really good. He's a super accessible speaker and author. And then there's lots of other books like, so one thing I've got, which I use a lot, is a thing called Information is Beautiful. So it's a book. If I'm short of some inspiration, I'll just kind of idly leaf through that with a cup of tea, and then I'll, hopefully inspiration will strike. So the main thing is exactly as Zach said, have a bit of a go, get into the habit of having a go, and you'll find very quickly that you get really good at it.
Thank you. And perhaps can you share with the audience some of the tools that you use the most for visualization in your day-to-day work?
Yeah, sure. So I'll tell that. So we use, so the tools and that kind of resource slide that Zach had earlier is pretty much the tool set that I use most. I used to use Excel a lot, but I actually find some of the, so Excel's, what's positive about it? It's super accessible, it's everywhere, the charts, there's loads of different kind of charts. It can lead you down a little bit of a wrong road in terms of a lot of clutter and all the rest of it. I think they've still got pie charts in there, but if you just use those 8 kind of points that we talked about before to help you improve your chart, then Excel's a great and really accessible way of doing it. If you have, if you've got if you're lucky enough to have access to Tableau, I think Tableau is a fantastic tool. It's really intuitive. There's a huge amount of online resource that you can kind of self-learn. And so my kind of 2 go-to things are Tableau, and Alteryx. Alteryx is a great tool for kind of munching and crunching data, and so bringing data sets together, blending data, sorting data, filtering data, and then visualizing it in Tableau. So those would be the ways that I would do it. But it's, I mean, recognize the audience, there's, there'll be a whole spectrum of different type of organizations represented here. You can start super simple, you can start with a set of free tools, and you can still get a long way down the road just by doing the things that we talked about in this little recipe that we've laid out.
I'll add on to that. We use a variety of different tools. At least I come across a variety of different data visualization tools in my day-to-day at Bloomberg. So quite familiar and have been quite hands-on with Tableau as well as ClickSense and Click, which is a very similar platform for data visualization, kit around dashboards and interactive analytics. Always, you can never get away from Excel and even PowerPoint for creating visualization sometimes. But increasingly, my team has been working towards more, as our data needs and technology has scaled up, using different libraries in Python and R and even JavaScript. So things like Matplotlib and Seaborn in Python have become quite prominent and prevalent. And in terms of workflow, and maybe this ties well into the other sessions for Data for Good, as you build up your analytic practice or incorporate these, data visualization is a very easy platform to just tie into your current processes. If you're talking through doing analytics or giving a presentation, you can use any level of depth for these tools to jump in and make a presentation, whether it's a pad and a pen, Microsoft Excel, Tableau, or some more of the coding languages where you get very fine-grained tools to create these visualizations.
And I think earlier in the presentation, Zach, you used an example, quite an interesting one, on the climate footprint and how you can show that in a very visual manner. I wonder whether each of you can perhaps share an example of what you thought was a remarkable use of data visualization and perhaps the impact that it had on local communities to some extent.
Absolutely. So if I can maybe give two examples. The first example, I think, is a very common historic example that is used in data visualization circles, and that's a doctor by the name of John Snow in the 1850s here in London started mapping the outbreak of cholera. There was widespread outbreaks, but it wasn't clear where the source was, and the understanding of the medicine and science beyond the time wasn't proficient enough to understand what might be causing it. So this doctor started collecting reports and anecdotes of where outbreaks were occurring, what are the neighborhoods and the buildings where they're getting sick. And he started noticing a trend where there were very particular clusters around, I guess, water access or wells or places where the tenants in the buildings would go to get water. And cholera was spread, unfortunately, through, I think, mixing between drinking water and sewage waste. But by doing an early form of data visualization, creating a heat map of where the outbreaks were occurring, he was able to identify where the leaks were occurring and prevent further outspread. And I think that is a pretty good textbook historic example given in these circles. The other example I'll go to, which is one that came across recently, and I believe if you search online for, it's either like share of the wealth or how much is a billion, but it's a web page that someone developed that shows the relative scale of what $1 billion or what the share of billionaires hold in terms of wealth versus like the global 99%. And the way this takes shape is that you look at the web page and there's a small square on the left side this is $1,000 or £1,000 or whatever the currency is, and you keep scrolling and it keeps moving and moving and moving, and it starts to show the relative scale of the distribution of wealth. And it's quite effective because you spend a lot of time scrolling, and it tells a very clear narrative that the scale of 1 billion, even compared to 1 million, is quite vast. I don't know if I have too many comments in terms of the impact that's had quite yet, but I think it's quite effective way to tell that message.
Definitely. Jonathan, is there any example you would want to share from your perspective?
Yeah, actually, I really like those two examples, Zach. The historical example I've given, I'll get the name wrong, but maybe we can distribute it to the audience or people later. But it's basically something to this visualization, again, sort of 200-300 years ago, whenever it was, and it's the long march from Paris to Moscow and back with Napoleon's army. And it starts with a very brilliant kind of very thick, heavy line. And as they go along, as the winter gets colder, as it gets closer and closer to Moscow, and conditions become worse and worse, you see this line narrow and narrow. And then eventually the line comes back, and it's also cleverly got the kind of time series on it, so that by the number of people returning to Paris after this long march, vastly reduced compared to those that set off. I think it's a brilliant piece of visualization. I think going back to this whole thing around COVID, I think we've all got a lot better at understanding little line charts and graphs and things that you wouldn't see necessarily previously. You see a lot of now. I actually think if you want to look at, if you go to the kind of web and look at the work that there's a couple of guys in the Financial Times have done around visualization of COVID, there's some tremendously interesting work and quite complex charts that convey a lot of deep information. They require some investment and study from the audience, but they are brilliant pieces of visualization. And again, all of those I think are, they're super available on the web. So I'd go to the COVID FT charts for those.
Thank you. And actually we have another question, an interesting question coming from the audience on when you present results, for instance, to key stakeholders, let's say board members, sometimes those stakeholders do not necessarily know what to expect from a visualization, your presentation. So can you perhaps elaborate a bit more on how this work, this process of visualization, storytelling can help, and which are the challenges that you can also face along the way?
Yeah,
it's a very long question.
Yes, I'll take that first. I know exactly the situation. It's a tough one. So again, just if you go back to the kind of key elements of storytelling, think about the audience and where they're coming from. What do they know? What do they not know? If you're dealing with colleagues, so people who are in the same kind of line of business as you, or not-for-profits, whatever they are, they may have a lot of already really rich technical know-how and kind of background information. So you can shortcut a lot of things you'd have to explain to a more general audience. So think about who you're presenting to. I think people, all of us have a much shorter attention span than we possibly imagine. So you've got to get to the point super quick. Still, the structure of the story, the arc of the story is the same, but it needs to, you can compress that. So if you're thinking, right, this is going to be a 17-minute presentation, I would try and get it down to like 5, so that you can get to what's the key slides in all of this, and what are the key messages that we're going to bring out. Being clear about that is really important. Applying all of the rules and guidelines that we talked about really helps bring that story out and make it crisp and understandable. And the thing you've got to do for your audience, if you put yourself in other people's shoes, there's nothing more flattering for people than for them to look at something and be able to immediately understand what it's about. We all like doing it because we all feel a lot smarter and better about ourselves. So if you can put yourself in their shoes and say, how can I make it as easy as possible to really grasp the essential point, it makes the whole thing more influential. It helps you really understand it helps people really understand what they're trying to grasp, and when they do that, they will be influenced by having a positive experience of looking at that information.
Zach, is there anything you would add to that?
I think Jonathan said it in better words than I could. I guess maybe I'll add just a thought that came is that I quite often think of this practice as always trying to convince somebody of something. And I think back to when I was a child and I was trying to convince my parents to let me stay out, past my bedtime, or, have sugary cereals on the weekends or something like that. But that practice is there's something I'm going after. There's some sort of message I want to convey. I want to stay up past X o'clock. And then I start building the supporting points, and it's like reason 1, reason 2, reason 3. And I think that there is a time where that takes the form maybe of like an argumentative essay, but the point here with data visualization is that we're able to slide in those explanatory facts with visuals that tell the story for you and create that interpretive story. And given just the nature of people, we tend to be visual learners and visual creatures, where when you see something, it creates a space in someone's mind that sticks a little bit harder sometimes than words can. And so whether that means working backwards from I know what I want to try to convey and I need to find the the best examples that highlight that case, or you're going from the ground up where you're exploring with data what the relationship between your bedtime and your enjoyment is. It comes to just trying to sell that message and be persuasive and using visualizations to tell that story for you, because a picture is worth 1,000 words.
And I think with that, I think we can go on and on about data visualization and storytelling, because there are so many techniques, so many things to say. But if you were, and I think you started on this, Zach, but if you were both to leave the audience with one idea, one piece of advice, what would that be? Jonathan, do you want to give that a
yes.
go?
Have a go every day for 20 days, and by the time you finish that, you'll find you're pretty good at it.
Really, and for me, I'll say, if I can't say also have a go, I will say find some examples in your day-to-day when you see data visualization. Try to copy it or try to think, why did they make this choice? Because as you ask those questions, you might stumble upon why they made that chart, and maybe you find how it helped their argument, or maybe it informs how you can yourself make a chart in the same way.
Well, thank you very much, both. This was a great presentation, a very interesting discussion. Thank you for sharing your expertise with everyone, and thank you for all the audience for joining us today. We have another session actually coming up at 2:30 p.m. BST, so if you haven't yet signed up, it's still time to do so. And we hope you will join us tomorrow too. Thank you, everyone.